This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
This episode is brought to you by AWS. Amazon Q Business is the generative AI assistant that can securely understand your business data, summarize results, and streamline tasks. Learn what Amazon Q Business can do for you at aws.com/learn more.
Hello, it's Gareth. This is the Somewhere on Earth podcast for Tuesday, the 17th of December. And we are, of course, with the Evergreen podcast community. And we're guests of All Is Joy Studios here in lovely Soho in central London. And joining me today for some expert commentaries, Peter Guest. It's been a while, Peter. What have you been up to?
Well, as you can imagine, Gareth, it's been a slightly fraught time in tech and politics.
Stuff's been going on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Keeps you busy though, doesn't it?
Just about. I'm sure we'll come to a few of them pretty soon.
I think we will. Keeps them out of the pub, doesn't it, people? There we are. Good to see you again, Peter. All right, and coming up today, we're looking at how HTS harnessed a whole load of technology to enable the dramatic overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria. Meanwhile, from Indonesia, we have a first-hand account via Peter of the environmental costs of the nickel industry behind the components in the electric vehicles on our roads. It's all right here on the Somewhere on Earth podcast. Well, they made it look easy, removing a 5-decade-strong brutal dictatorship in just a matter of days. Yes, this is the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and they're now in charge of Syria as ex-President Bashar al-Assad languishes, we're told, somewhere in Russia. Yes, this is a story of armoured vehicles and guns, but what most of the commentary has missed is the crucial role of technology in HTS's success. Everything from 3D printing to drones. Let's discuss this further with Broderick McDonald. He researches conflict at King's College London, where he's an associate fellow. He's with the ICSR, that's the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. And let's just talk through some of the technology that HTS have had at their disposal. Can we start with 3D printing, Broderick?
Yeah, so HTS uses 3D printing to create some of the small FPV drones that we've seen them use in this offensive. And it's a fairly sophisticated setup that they've developed since 2019. Really, they've not been sort of sudden newcomers to this technology, although it's advanced quite a bit in the last few years. They've been slowly developing their capabilities over the past 5 years, and then we really saw in the last 2 weeks the effects of that as they launched their offensive that ultimately took Damascus.
So they're talking about it's like 3D printing weapons, then mainly, is it?
We haven't seen HTS use 3D printing for actual firearms or weapons, likely because the firearms that have been produced by 3D printers in the West and by other extremist groups tend to be very non-durable, usable for a handful of shots and then sort of, throwaways after that. HTS prefers to use them to develop parts for small FPV drones that they can't purchase either online or through other countries. It's sort of hard to procure, equipment that they can then produce domestically within Syria.
Yeah, and would these 3D printers be the kind of thing that maybe kids have at school? That kind of sort of off-the-shelf 3D printer, or do they have access to more specialist material?
They're just consumer 3D printers. So, I don't know if kids in schools will have exactly the same models, but by no means are they using something that other non-state actors couldn't get their hands on. Okay. And I think that's what makes it concerning. This technology is out there for non-state actors in many countries around the world for a couple $1,000s. They could get started, with similar equipment. Now, of course, they can't produce an entire drone through 3D printing, but they can speed up and augment that process and procure parts that they would otherwise struggle to get.
Right. So they can 3D print the parts for drones, not the whole drone. Tell me about the drones, though. What kind of drone capabilities do they have?
So this was the big technological leap that we saw in this lightning offensive. HTS was using two primary types of drones. They were using, firstly, small FPV kamikaze drones, similar to what we've seen in Ukraine over the past 2 years. So these are, guided FPV drones where they can be flown into high-value targets such as tanks or, artillery positions, even targeting senior regime officials. And I think most people have probably seen videos in the media of how these small sort of consumer drones work. The other more sophisticated drone technology that they deployed during this offensive was these larger range rocket-propelled drones, which actually function more similar to something like a guided missile than a small consumer drone. These were also domestically produced in warehouses and had a range of, from best estimates, up to 50 kilometers. It could also carry a larger payload. And they really helped HTS to strike targets, a lot further away and with a much bigger impact than they have ever had before.
It's very tempting just to get very carried away with these drones that we've been talking about. Is there a danger, Broderick, of perhaps overplaying the role of drones and even like the 3D printing aspects and the other elements here in this story?
I think so. Drones played a role in this offensive, and they played an important role. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that the real causes of HTS's success in this offensive, which was very rapid and actually brought down the Assad regime after a brutal 14-year-long civil war, was much more to do with the weakness of Iran and Russia and the regime itself, which had been overstretched and distracted increasingly in the past few years, as well as the overall professionalization of HTS over the past 5 years as it prepared for this offensive. Those two factors explain, the bulk of how HTS did this in the past 2 weeks. The drones are part of that story, but I think that they augmented and helped what was already underway due to these larger factors.
So, Peter, have you been following this a lot?
It's interesting. It's kind of a full circle story because I first started hearing about the use of consumer drones in conflict in Syria. You're talking more than a decade ago. They were kind of pioneers in using simple consumer off-the-shelf drones for in the war. But then, obviously, over the last, where are we now, 15, 14 years, you've seen that develop firstly in Ukraine, which began, I think, in Donbass after the Russian invasion. People started to use DJI drones and others they could get off the internet for surveillance, for spotting. And then that's developed dramatically. And I think a lot of listeners will know, we've talked about it on the podcast before, that jury-rigged drones became a big part of the Ukrainian resistance to the full-scale invasion. So there's a couple of things that I think are fascinating about it. And Broderick's made this point already better than I will. But these are devices that are ubiquitous, they're affordable, and they actually make enormously complex avionics and control surfaces available to an amateur, right? They're intuitive to use. And then add to that the kind of additive manufacturing, 3D printers. They're similar, right? They require a certain amount of technical know-how, but you can download from the internet plans that can you put into your machine on a USB stick and you can print out objects. And what that basically means is that you can replicate in miniature a supply chain in your garage. And beyond that, in a conflict situation, as we saw in Ukraine, you also can speed up its innovation cycle. One of the most fascinating things you see in Ukraine is, guys working with their friends in the field. So their friend in the field will say, I need something that can do this. Drop a grenade, or my grenade dropping tool isn't working very well. Can you modify it for me? A guy on CAD in Kyiv can modify that, send it back to the field, refine it and refine it and refine it in an innovation cycle, which is kind of unthinkable in traditional weapons manufacture. It just makes this kind of technology incredibly powerful and incredibly adaptable, as well as just being available.
What about the skills kind of thing then, Broderick? And of course, Peter touched on that in the amount of blueprints that you can get available online pretty easily. But, here we're talking about some pretty advanced, I'm sure, professionalized military skills to mount an operation like this, harnessing the technology, as we've been hearing. Is it the kind of stuff that these are, relatively young people learning off YouTube videos? How is that happening?
I think some of it can be learned through, online tutorials and online resources. But we should also remember HTS has undergone a serious professionalization over the past 5 years. So it established a military academy in Idlib, which is its enclave, and it's trained, successive cohorts of specialized units, not just on drones, which are called the Shaheen brigades. It's Arabic for Falcon. But they've also trained artillery brigades. They've also trained breaching, sabotage units, and special forces units called the Red Brigades. So HTS has done a lot to build up its military training and capacity within its home base. And then I think you saw, the effects of this sort of materialize over the past 2 weeks. The other piece of it, which we don't fully know yet, is reports in the Washington Post that Ukraine sent 20 military operators and approximately 150 small FPV drones to the Syrian rebels in the past, 6 months or so. And we don't know exactly what role that played, how much of this knowledge they developed, domestically or through online materials like we spoke about, and how much of that could have come from outside countries. But I think that by and large, we've seen non-state actors in a range of different conflicts, right? From Azerbaijan to Libya to Syria and Iraq, use small armed consumer drones. And I don't think that the technology or the skills needed to develop and then operate these tools is so great that you can't just, use what is available online with a bit of ingenuity and a little bit of, discussion amongst the group. To create something that is actually quite lethal and can have a huge impact on the battlefield.
So, that's a cause for concern. Maybe some celebration for the many people who are not particularly fond of the Assad regime, but the idea that some non-state actors can mount a military initiative of this complexity and indeed unseat a whole state apparatus in this one, not quite the whole state apparatus, but certainly unseat the leadership, is quite a thing. How much of a concern is that for you, Broderick, as somebody who studies radicalization?
I think it's a big threat. Number one, HTS, which is the group that really led on the development of these new drones that we're seeing in Syria today. This is a designated group by the United Nations, the European Union, the United States, and others. Now, there's some discussion as to whether that group will be delisted or not, but we should remember that this is a group that started in Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and it has, become more local and more pragmatic over the past few years, but it's still not an actor that, most of us would want to trust 100% at this time, at least. We'll see what happens in the weeks ahead. And looking outside of Syria, there's hundreds of extremist groups, both far-right groups and Salafi jihadist groups in different countries around the world. This technology is now, so available and so low cost that there's really very little stopping, groups from Africa to Europe to North America, developing similar capacities and then deploying them right here at home or in active conflicts that are happening around the world today.
Broderick, thank you so much. That's Broderick McDonald of King's College London. Well, now let's hear firsthand about the environmental costs of the so-called Green Revolution. Peter has been on a 2,000-kilometre trip around Sulawesi in Indonesia, investigating the nickel industry's devastating effects on the environment and human rights. This is an investigation for the Gecko project, and it's available online. Peter, this was one heck of a trip, wasn't it? Tell me, just set the scene here. Sulawesi in Indonesia. Give us the geography here.
Yeah, it's my ongoing desire to go to the most beautiful places in the world and find the grimmest versions of them. So just to set the scene a little bit, Indonesia is sitting on some of the biggest reserves of nickel in the world. And it's been through several waves of mining of that nickel. But over the last 5 years, there's been a wave of just far greater magnitude. So nickel, you probably know, it's a major component of stainless steel, but it's also a major part of the batteries that go into electric vehicles and other high-capacity batteries used in the green industries. So the Indonesian government, understandably, decided a few years ago that it really wanted to make the most of that opportunity. So tried to dominate the market for nickel. What that meant was giving tax breaks to nickel miners, but also forcing them to stay onshore and do all their processing and bring jobs. So we decided that we would go and have a look at the entirety of the nickel supply chain. What that meant is we flew into southeast Sulawesi, which is to say, stunning place, beautiful beaches, lovely lush verdant forests, and vast nickel mines, these huge Martian landscapes that have just been carved out of the earth. Some of them are sort of 2, 3, 4 kilometers across, right up down to the coastline. You just see this red dust rising up around them, right over the top of these villages. Now, Sulawesi used to be the Spice Islands, right? And so you still have all of these traditional industries, these people drying clothes, and the outside these vast mining concessions. So we tracked those. We went and visited the villages around there. We drove from there into the kind of processing facilities. These are sort of industrial cities that have only come up in the last 5 years, just sprung up from nowhere. These kind of, well, as you'll hear from Adi later on, as one of my colleagues on the thing, but he referred to them as Mordor, right? You just these smokestacks pouring, or coal dust and smoke over the landscape. And yeah, we just sort of tracked that whole chain all the way up to the ports where they were shipping the stuff out.
What is the nickel used for then?
So a lot of it is still used in stainless steel. The biggest buyer of Indonesian nickel is the Chinese automotive industry. But increasingly, they're also trying to use this nickel to turn it into the cathodes that are used in batteries. And some of these facilities that we saw are actually starting that process of turning it into the next stage of refinement, which can then go into a battery. Again, most of that is going to China.
Right. And when you say batteries, EV batteries?
EV batteries.
Right. Okay. So you get a real sense of this whole supply chain, the beginning of that supply chain. And you mentioned Adi there. We're going to hear a clip of you and Adi actually there. But what do we need to know about Adi? He's a fellow investigative journalist who is working on this story as well then.
Exactly. Adi had to spend 3 weeks in the back seat of a car with me. So he's my dear friend and a fellow investigative reporter who's sick of the sight of me.
Been through a lot together. So let's hear some audio from your visit. And this is you and Adi, and you're looking across at one of the mining concessions. So can you just set the scene? We're about to hear it, but what are you seeing as you stand there?
Well, when you see these mines, I mean, nickel is mined close to the surface in open pits. So it isn't like a mine shaft with an entrance, people disappearing into it. It's this vast quarry. The earth is sort of iron oxide red, and so it just rises in these huge gusts and plumes of red dust. If it's dry and hasn't rained, it goes right up into the atmosphere, and you'll just see these huge diggers, sometimes dozens of these diggers, just picking away at the red earth. It's quite shocking. And we were also putting drones up and looking at them, and if you see it from above, and it's like being on Mars.
Wow.
I actually didn't expect to see this massive mining concessions squeezing a very small village. I never thought that I would see huge mining concessions. Trees all gone. The sea is polluted. Like literally, like this is not a good place at all for someone to live in.
So it's literally surrounded by mining concessions, right? You have to drive through mines to get
It's
here.
literally surrounded by minings. Like few kilometers from this village is all mining concession, nickel mining concession.
And then on the outside of that, there's palm oil.
Yeah, so in between the village and the nickel mining concessions, we can see like swaths of palm oil plantations, which maybe have been there for years.
That really sets the scene for us there, Pete. Can you tell me a bit about the plight of the villagers then?
I mean, so that clip was recorded in a village called Morombo, which is probably one of the worst places hit by this industry. So that's a small village. It was originally a Bajau sea nomad community that settled on the shoreline. Now, they had a relatively thriving fishing industry. They had a relatively kind of good, sustainable set of livelihoods until the mining companies started to set up around them. And what you see when you go there is it's not just one mine, but several concessions that are just joined up in an arc around the village, slowly sort of squeezing them back and back against the shore. And, you know, the water that used to be clear, fresh water, which you'll see in other parts of the island, is red. It's the same colour as the mud. You know, the sediment that's rising up underneath the villages. And they often live in these stilt villages. And you'll see around the stilts this thick orange-red mud just clogging up everything. The fish have died or moved further offshore. They have to spend huge amounts of money, which they can't afford, to go off and fish further and further away for dwindling catches. And they don't really have any livelihood coming from the mine. They aren't employed there. They don't have the skills. They don't have the education and experience to go and work a digger or work in the smelters. So they're sort of left to their own, left downstream to be victims of it.
Yeah, and laws have been passed to make things very difficult, well, impossible really, for any of these villagers or campaigners to, certainly legally, object to what's going on.
So this is one of the main causes of this. So I want to put it out here, first of all, that it isn't actually necessarily the case that you have to mine nickel like this. But in order to really capture the moment in the market, the Indonesian government has rolled out the red carpet for mining companies. They've deregulated to such an extent that environmental legislation has been cut. They've given the mines, or many of the mines and smelters, this special status. They call it the National Strategic Project status, which effectively grants it the same protection as a military base. You can't protest, you can't disrupt it. There are changes to the mining code that make it illegal to do anything which, quote, disrupts a mining industry, a mining company, which includes just protesting about it or complaining about it on the internet. So they've done everything they possibly can to empower the mining companies, which automatically has disempowered the people around them.
Now let's hear a little bit more from you and Addy. And here you are in another village.
Right. That's a pretty grim view, isn't it?
There used to be a nomadic tribe on the sea. Like they've lived for generations, like inside a boat with their families. But then, beginning in the 1990s, they start to inhabiting this land, the beach. But they're still, doing their way of life of catching the fish, using the spears. They used to dove to search for clamshell. It used to be surrounded by forests. As far as you can see, it's all surrounded by beautiful scenery. Then in the mid-2000s, then suddenly all changed when the mining companies started to mine this village for nickels, and as you can see, it's all squeezed slowly by the expansion of the nickel mining companies. Now they just live. As you can see, it's all surrounded by. There's the jetty port to send the nickel ores. Yeah, it's pretty grim.
Pretty grim, as that clip ends there, Pete. So just finally and briefly then, we all want to, most of us, I think, want to decarbonise the economy. Yet I don't think anybody would want the kind of pollution and devastation that you've been reporting on in this investigation. How do we square that?
I mean, and it isn't just pollution, it's also emissions, right? These are often mines being put on top of rainforests, which have, huge rolls of carbon sink. They're often, the smelters are powered by coal, which somewhat runs counter to the decarbonisation narrative. I guess what I'd say is that this isn't the only model. And in fact, there are nickel smelters operating in other countries where they use hydropower, where they have environmental legislation to prevent the damage done by the mines, where they have, rules that say you have to make good after you've dug this enormous pit, where, human rights are respected. These are all choices, and they're compromises that someone has decided to make. So progress doesn't have to involve that kind of sacrifice. There are other models. They may mean moving slower. They may mean taking less profit, but they're definitely possible.
All right, Peter, thank you. Final question then. How can people see this investigation?
The investigation was published on the Gecko Project. You'll find it on thegeckoproject.org and also at New Lines magazine in the US, which will be in print in January.
Okay, and over this holiday festive season, but over the holiday season, in all seriousness, I do urge you, dear listener, just to check that out. I'd say it will take you 15, 20 minutes. It's quite a long read, but it's very, very rewarding and disturbing. Brilliantly illustrated as well as written, and there are elements of video and so on embedded. Just there's a whole tech story and how they've actually created the whole website there as well. It's really impressive stuff, and it's important journalism, and that really matters. Right, enough grandstanding from me. Let me just tell you that you can get in touch with us. Our email is hello@somewhereonearth.co. On WhatsApp, we are code 44 7486 329 484. And our website is somewhereonearth.co. And we're on pretty much all those kind of socials out there. You can find us through Somewhere on Earth, the global technology podcast or variants of that. And of course, we're with Evergreen. And they've got a rather jolly website at evergreenpodcast.com. If you can handle any further metadata, then let me just tell you that audio today has been by Eon here at All Is Joy Studios in Soho in London. The production manager is Liz Tui. You've been hearing from Peter. The producer and editor is Anya Literovich. And I'm Gareth. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. It's Michael Calore, Director of Consumer Tech and Culture at Wired, here with my colleagues, senior writer Lauren Good.
Hello.
And Wired contributor Zoe Schiffer.
Hey, everyone.
We're here to tell you about our new podcast, Uncanny Valley, a show about the people, power, and influence of Silicon Valley.
Every week, we get together to talk about how technology and culture from the Valley is influencing our everyday lives.
We dig into questions like, will we ever get our privacy back? Is OpenAI for real? And how are Silicon Valley billionaires impacting U.S. elections?
The first episode of Uncanny Valley comes out on October 31st. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.